Nintendo as a company has been around for more than 130 years. In 1963, they shortened their name from Nintendo Playing Card Company down to just Nintendo. They experimented as a taxi company, a food company, and even a hotel chain, before in 1968, they brought us their very first toy. In 1980, they brought us those Nintendo Game & Watches. In 1981, we saw that very first Donkey Kong on the arcade. In 1983, we got that first Mario Brothers arcade game. And then in 1985, after the video game crash, Nintendo stepped in and marketed the Nintendo Entertainment System as a toy. From 1989 to 1993, we were involved in the console wars. In today's video, we're gonna take a look at some television commercials that Nintendo and Sega used to get us excited, to help crack our parents' wallets open so we could experience some of the video games that we loved in our childhood. In the 80s, everybody was excited about video games. From 1981 to 1982, Nintendo sold 60,000 Donkey Kong machines in the US. In 1982, arcades were pulling in $27 billion in revenue, and video game consoles were pulling in another $14 billion. This caused many manufacturers to want to get on that bandwagon, but too many competitors and too many low-quality games actually had people step away from arcades and consoles and move over to personal computers. From 1982 to 1985, the arcades dropped in revenue by 66%, and consoles dropped by 93% in revenue. Atari lost $536 million and were dumping their video game cartridges in a landfill in New Mexico. In 1985, no one wanted anything to do with video games. So Nintendo marketed the Nintendo Entertainment System as a toy, not an electronic. The first NES console came with Rob the Robot, a toy to help us play those games. The action set came with a toy gun so we could play Duck Hunt. They even named it an entertainment system, just so it wasn't associated with video games. Let's take a look at one of Nintendo's first commercials with Rob the Robot in it.
Will it be you? Will your family be the first to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? Will you be the first to see, to touch, to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot? He follows the commands you put on screen to help you tackle even the toughest challenge. Will you be the first to raise the incredibly accurate Zapper and play games like Duck Hunt and Hogan's Alley? The first to build a library of game packs like Kung Fu and Golf? Even games like Excitebike that you program yourself. Will you be the first to get all this in one package? The Nintendo Entertainment System, where video technology is more than a game.
Now, I know there was a lot of information at the start of the video, but using that information and looking at this commercial, you can really see how hard they were pushing that Rob the Robot was the toy that you used, the technology that we used to play this game. Even the way they introduced the Zapper in that commercial, they show it to us as a toy that we could be the first to use to play the game of Duck Hunt. And then after they've introduced that, they've concreted that fact that this is a toy, the Nintendo Entertainment System is a toy, then they start to talk about building a library of games for the Nintendo. Let's take a look at another commercial that they really pushed Rob the Robot in.
When you get hold of the Nintendo Entertainment System, when you master Rob, the video robot, and meet the challenge of Gyromite, when you shoot the light-sensing Zapper, when you play the system with so many arcade hits, you're playing with power. The Nintendo Entertainment System Deluxe Set. Batteries not included, Super Mario Brothers, and other games sold separately.
Watching that commercial, the hype and the excitement they're building in that, as a kid, I would have been begging my parents for a Nintendo so I could play Gyromite alongside Rob the Robot, or get to play Duck Hunt with that Zapper. Now, a lot of teens at the time were kind of pulling away from video games. They'd experienced those dark days with those poor quality video games, so Nintendo was aiming for a younger audience. There might not have been a lot of story involved in those first games, but soon Nintendo would find success with the Super Mario Bros., Zelda, and Final Fantasy. All games that were more driven by those characters.
Super Mario is back. He's blasting through worlds where no one has ever been. He's taking on enemies no one else dares. This time Mario pops up power wherever he goes, so he's bigger and badder than ever before. You've never seen creatures like these. You've never had an adventure like this. It's everything you've dreamed of and worlds more. It's Super Mario 2, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power.
Watch Zelda become a legend on your Nintendo Entertainment System.
Zelda! Up the rocks! Which way to go? Good times! Pee hands! Levers! Zelda! Zelda! Zelda!
The Legend of Zelda. A never-ending adventure new for your Nintendo Entertainment System.
Zelda!
By 1987, Nintendo had taken 65% of the video game hardware market. But in 1989, Sega stepped up to challenge Nintendo for its crown. Sega brought us the Genesis with its 16-bit arcade graphics, and early Sega commercials came with the tagline of "Genesis does what Nintendo don't."
Genesis does.
16-bit sports strategy.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports moves.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
What Nintendo don't. The 16-bit Genesis system by Sega. Genesis does it all.
With that aggressive marketing strategy, Sega positioned the Genesis as a console that was for teens, while the NES was just a toy for kids. And with that 16-bit hardware, Sega leaned really hard on the fact that their technology was better than Nintendo's.
Gotta go.
Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
What's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast, too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
Wait, kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
Now, when the Sega Genesis first came out, Nintendo players were still using the NES. But what Sega didn't realize was a lot of us didn't care about the technology. We just wanted our games to be fun. And in 1991, when the Super Nintendo was released, we were hyped and ready for Super Mario World.
Introducing the next generation from Nintendo, new Super Mario World, created especially for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It's a bit more exciting, a bit more challenging, a bit more graphic, a bit more colorful, a bit more realistic, a bit more levels, a bit more secret, a bit more enemies, a bit more friends, a bit more sound, a bit hotter, a bit cooler, a bit weird, a bit more revolutionary, a bit more Mario, a bit more of what you want. It's 16-bit, and it's yours only if you get new Super Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
And at that point, Mario was the reason. Nintendo had those iconic characters that Sega didn't. So Sega decided to step up. And after looking at quite a few different mascots they could have used, they decided to come forward with Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic was cooler than Mario. Sega was still aiming for that teen audience. And Sonic the Hedgehog definitely had attitude.
Danita Stokes, president of HAG.
It's bad enough that Sega Genesis has the most 16-bit games, but this new Sonic the Hedgehog, oh, he really doth my doilies. They say he's incredibly fast. Well, what's the hurry, mister? And about his attitude. Smarty pants. Why can't it be more like that nice boy Mario? Oh! Little brat!
Now, get Sonic free when you buy a Sega Genesis system at its new price of $149.99.
And having that character of Sonic actually seemed to work for Sega. In the holiday season of 1991, the Sega Genesis outsold the Super Nintendo 2-1. Now, up to this point, Nintendo always seemed a little passive when it came to Sega's marketing strategy. But realizing they were losing some ground, Nintendo decided to focus on what the Super Nintendo had that the Sega Genesis didn't have, like the Mode 7 graphic chip, which simulated that 3D effect perspective. When the Super Nintendo launched, one of the most prominent titles they had was F-Zero. With that Mode 7 graphics chip, the 3D made this game look more complex compared to the earlier racing games on the home console. And games like Pilot Wings, where they used that Mode 7 graphics chip to better simulate that 3D environment.
Nothing prepares you for F-Zero, created for the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System. You won't believe the power. You won't believe the control. You won't believe the jumps, the curves, or the feeling you get until you experience it for yourself.
Wow, that's fast.
F-Zero for the ultimate G-Force, only on the next generation from Nintendo. Now you're racing with power, superpower.
But even with that Mode 7 and those 3D graphics, Nintendo acknowledged that they'd lost dominancy of the home console market. So 1 year into the lifespan of the Super Nintendo, they lowered the price down to $149 to match the Genesis, while Sega just lowered the price of the Genesis down to $129 instead. One thing that did help the Super Nintendo was the fact that Capcom decided to maintain that exclusivity of the home port of the popular brawler arcade game Street Fighter II to the Super Nintendo when it was released in 1992.
Stay calm. Concentrate on the screen. Street Fighter II is on Super Nintendo. From the arcades, the ultimate combat game. Each fighter has a different technique, an acrobatic move, a hidden punch. It's on the streets now, exclusively on Super Nintendo. Super Nintendo with Street Fighter II. It's unbeatable.
Now, all this time, those console wars weren't just happening on the home console. That battle was also happening on the handhelds. And in July of 1989, after seeing the success of those Game & Watch single-game handhelds, Nintendo decided to develop a portable console. And they brought us the Game Boy. Let's check out the very first Game Boy commercial.
They said it wasn't humanly possible, but now you can have all the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Plus, Game Boy comes with the outrageous new game, Tetris. And for head-to-head competition, use the revolutionary video link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, portable power.
Now, the Game Boy was affordable, it had great battery life, and it had a really extensive library of games. You could buy it in a bundle with Tetris or with Super Mario Land. But, as we've seen, Sega was never one to be outdone by Nintendo.
We at Sega have learned that some people are actually throwing their one-color portables away. We urge you to stop. There are still many practical uses for them. Fix a wobbly chair. Look, a cat massager. Spread cheese snacks. We at Sega admit we may have an unfair advantage with Game Gear being a full-color portable with tons of new games. This is still no excuse. Use them to tenderize meat, or even as sunblock. Please, help save the planet.
In April of 1991, Sega released that Game Gear. That Game Gear came with that backlit color screen and a more powerful Z80 CPU. And again, Sega positioned that their technology was better than Nintendo's, better than the Game Boy. Now, the Game Gear did outdo the Atari Lynx and the Turbo Express, but with that notoriously horrible battery life and what felt like a lack of support from Sega, the Game Gear never did outdo the Game Boy. And the Game Boy really established itself as a cultural icon. Between the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color that was released in 1998, they've sold an estimated 118 million units worldwide, which technically makes the Game Boy the 4th best-selling console ever, and gave Nintendo the ability to take that battle in the console wars.
Sonic the Hedgehog runs, jumps, moves, and spins at supersonic speed. And now, he's loose. He's a burst of speed, a dash of fun. A mischievous freak. He's everywhere. Because now, he's on Game Gear. And best of all, Sonic's free when you buy Game Gear. But hurry, he's moving fast. Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega.
Nintendo may have won the battle of the handheld consoles, but the console wars themselves were just about to heat up. In September of 1995, Sony released the PlayStation to the North American market. The PlayStation was originally designed alongside Nintendo as a CD-ROM peripheral for the Super Nintendo, but after that project failed, it kind of looked like, from their television marketing, that Sony took a play out of Sega's playbook.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here.
Check it out. What do you think about that? We got real-time, 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy?
Feel a little like your days are numbered?
I'm gonna have to ask you to leave.
You're hurting my elbow.
Is that Italian?
No, Bandicoot. It's an Australian name.
PlayStation might be one of the three big ones now, but back in the day, the Sony PlayStation was kind of the underdog. The battle in the console wars really was still focused between Sega and Nintendo. In May of 1995, 4 months before its scheduled release, Sega surprised us with the Sega Saturn.
Let's compare Sega Saturn's games to games on Plaything. Sega has a long history of creating true arcade games. Plaything's maker has no such history. Sega Saturn gives you arcade graphics and gameplay that could only come from the power of 3 processors. Plaything has only 1 processor. Sorry, Plaything, you're not worthy.
When we look at that commercial, we see that Sega wasn't pulling any punches. It didn't matter who they were up against, they were swinging. When the Sega Saturn was released, it came out with dual CPU architecture and 8 processors. Several of its games were direct ports from arcade games. While the Saturn did initially see success in Japan, by 1996, when Nintendo released that N64, the Saturn started losing market share in the US. And even though Nintendo decided to stick with those cartridges and not move to the CD-ROM like everyone else was, in 1996, after a delayed launch, Nintendo brought us the N64.
Here you go, man. Well, it's about time, dude. I've been waiting 63 years.
Hey, Timmy, I got you more fruit by the foot.
Awesome. This one's got tips for 3 new Nintendo 64 games. Bogus.
Now you can keep playing Nintendo 64 even longer than ever. With 90 new game tips from Fruit by the Foot. New N64 game tips from Fruit by the Foot. Your games still go on and on and on.
Hey, dude, your sister's cute.
With launch titles like Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64, Nintendo came in swinging with the Nintendo 64. And the N64 was the last of the systems to use those cartridges. Through the 80s and the 90s, we got to take part in those console wars. A lot of us got to choose sides. But when Sony stepped in with the PlayStation, it really changed the playing field. The N64 was critically acclaimed, even though it did sell less than the newcomer of the PlayStation. In 1999, after the stumbles with the Saturn, Sega released the Dreamcast, which is looked at as a commercial failure. And with its discontinuation in 2001, signifies the end of Sega's 18 years in the console market. And in 2001, with the release of the GameCube, Nintendo was the last one to step away from those cartridge-based systems. With Sony's release of the PlayStation, it kind of signaled the end of the console wars as we'd known them, and was the start of Sony's rise to power in the video game industry. With the release of the PlayStation 2 in the year 2000, Sony's success just continued. But when we look back at the console wars that we saw in the 80s and 90s, which side did you stand on? Were you Sega or were you Nintendo?
Which one of you jokers goes by the name Mario?
It's me!
Could you step outside, please?
Welcome to Mario Party, where you and 3 friends battle it out all night long. With 6 adventure boards and 50 mini-games, this party's just getting going. Mario Party, only on Nintendo 64. But it's me, Mario!
Yeah, tell it to the judge.
Get in or get out.